I'm here with Ciaran Collins in the month of January. Ciaran would have looked after this crop last summer. Ciaran, can you give me the basic agronomy on this field of fodder beet, please?
Yeah, I suppose firstly we're starting with rotation, and I suppose it's important to remember that you keep at least 2 years between sugar beet crops, and also 2 years between away from brassicas as well would be important. And then I suppose in terms of the fertilisation of the crop, we're really starting with the basics of a good soil test. 2 tonnes per acre, 5 tonnes per hectare of lime was applied on the ploughing here pre-cultivation. And I suppose just in terms of the soil test report, then your P and K is governed by what you find. This would be index 3 for P and K, so would have got 40 kilos of P and 165 kilos of K, and that's applied in a compound normally. And I suppose the other important part of the soil test then are the trace elements. I suppose boron in particular is one that you're watching out for with fodder beet. Boron is very water soluble, so levels in Ireland tend to be low, but it's very important to get your soil test report and to determine the levels. In this scenario here, there was actually boron in the compound fertiliser that went on pre-sowing, but it was also topped up during the season via a foliar application. And I suppose the other trace element to watch out for with fodder beet is manganese. This area here in particular would be low on manganese, and again would have got a foliar spray during the season.
And Ciaran, with your herbicide program, was it a 1 or 2 herbicide?
So this was 2 herbicides were applied here, and I suppose weed control in beet is so important. Beet isn't very competitive, so we need to get, I suppose, good establishment in that. So you can do pre-emergence, but I suppose the majority of beet in Ireland now is sprayed early post-emergence, so that's at expanded cotyledon stage. So the predominant weed here was actually a mixture of charlock and volunteer oilseed rape. So this would have been a sulfonylurea would have been used, would have been a debut program. So the first one would have went on at expanded cotyledon stage, and a follow-up then 10 to 14 days later. There wasn't a requirement for a third herbicide here, but on occasion, particularly where grass weeds or maybe some difficult weeds like thistles or that are in a field, you may need a third application.
Ciaran, with chemistry becoming more under pressure with the beet crops, is there any other piece of advice you can give a farmer what he can do before or after the crop?
Yeah, certainly pre-ploughing, certainly get glyphosate on to lessen the weed burden, I suppose. That's the first thing. And I suppose the second bit of advice on that one is to know your weeds. It's really important that you know what your target weeds are, and you can tailor your program then appropriately. And I suppose maybe the third bit is weed size. It's very important to spray small, actively growing weeds, and when we can get those timings right, we can do a really good job on weed control.
And Ciaran, rotation obviously has quite a factor in weed control. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And again, I suppose, having a good rotation on the farm in general certainly helps, because you have alternative modes of action for controlling weeds. I suppose it does lessen, obviously, the incidence of resistance and that as well.
Ciaran, did you use a fungicide in this particular field?
So a fungicide was used in this crop of beet here because it was destined for late harvesting. I suppose the main diseases that you're looking for, I suppose, rust, powdery mildew, raw malaria can occur. So, for late harvested beet, we would always recommend a fungicide. There was a fungicide applied here in early August. And I suppose, apart from the disease, also most beet in Ireland is harvested still using belt machines, so it's very important to reduce harvest losses that you've got a good leaves on the beet when it's being harvested. So the fungicide does help in that perspective as well.
Would you apply a trace element when you're putting on your fungicide?
Again, I'd be guided by the soil test report. Manganese would generally go on earlier in the season, but maybe if the likes of magnesium was low, or maybe a top up on the boron, they would be the two you'd be looking at.
Ciaran, do you think there's a yield benefit by applying the fungicide?
Yes, I suppose it depends on harvesting date. If any beet that would be harvested maybe in October, the benefits of the fungicide would be minimal. But I suppose generally speaking, fodder beet is harvested later in the season because it's utilised over the winter and into the new year. So there would be a benefit from the fungicide from that perspective to keep that photosynthesis going a little bit longer into the autumn, and also then to preserve the leaves for harvesting to reduce harvest losses.